need to be much more serious about what we're trying to do with our kids, right?
You want to?
I do want. It's kind of related. I mean, I agree entirely about the massive point missing stuff which goes on when we assume that you can eliminate poverty through some kind of being better equipped at home to do this or that. And I entirely agree. Poverty is a structural thing. It's not magic to where you don't get jobs and other opportunities through improving education. Completely agree. But in a way, that general point feels to me slightly settling. So, for example, when you were describing Diana Bowman's approach and the idea that we should be socialising into independence, that is absolutely the kind of gospel, also according to many people who I suspect would be completely diametrically opposed to the point they used to be made.
Well, my point is that isn't what they think, and this document proves it.
Okay, but maybe not those people, but there is a certain kind of liberal tradition which would just think, what is a parent there to do? It is there, basically, to bring on, inculcate and equip somebody to be their own person in adulthood. That is absolutely the definition of what a parent is, right? So if parents aren't doing that, then that is kind of, sounds like, that's not so good parenting, right? But the way that you put it doesn't prove the point that the rest of what Bowman says follows, that somehow it's through a certain kind of aversive discipline that actually you create those people.
Well, she doesn't say that.
That's an entirely different empirical question, isn't it? So it seems to me that...
Yeah, but that's not what she says.
But
Sorry.
I'm just wondering whether you would be happy by your own lights if the debate went a certain kind of way and it was had better in your terms, and if we had a full and open discussion, and it's still been pretty much like smacking was detrimental to the achievement of that, whether you would be fine with that, because the point isn't really about smacking, the point is about the achievement of a certain kind of, autonomous adult. That's what we should be able to do.
I want to give Stuart a chance to respond. Are you just saying that everything is equally fine, all parents are fine?
Because presumably you're not saying we should smack people as much as possible. What you're saying is we should have the right to make that decision.
As early as possible, as late as necessary. Or is that abortion? I can't remember. Well, the interesting thing about the smacking stuff is that I am 99.9% sure that if definitive evidence came out to prove that smacking worked, the people who oppose smacking would ignore it. Because they always talk about evidence. Evidence proves. And actually, when you look at the evidence that they use, it's usually, it's either advocacy research or it's one-sided, or it's not actually accepting a kind of nuanced form of parenting. So actually, the extent to which you can do this statistically, but Robert Lazellier in Canada looks at this, and he argues that actually kind of brutal authoritarian parenting, you can statistically show that it's a bit problematic, has problematic outcomes. But the best outcomes are often where you have a kind of balanced approach where smacking is used as a kind of last port of call kind of thing, right? So it's the evidence thing is highly questionable. I just wanted to make one point, which is that the thing I'm really worried about is the expansion of the idea of harm. Right? And I'm a criminologist, so I look at this a lot in terms of what's being criminalised, right? And from all different perspectives. It's this idea that the John Stuart Mill's harm principle has kind of basically collapsed, because now what is harm has just become almost anything. Right? And once we start to move at the idea of emotional harm and making that a criminal offence, then it becomes expansive and expansive. And that's my concern, is that the people who are in Parliament and developing these policies do have a kind of zealot-like form of a sense of moral goodness, right? So they were almost in tears, right, when this went through. Right? They had tears in their eyes. Yes, we can now criminalise parents for smacking, but they don't see it like that. They see it as they're saving children, right? They're kind of like child savers. And they genuinely have this kind of sense of zealotry. And the reason I'm worried is perhaps I watch too much television. Well, I do watch too much television. But every time I turn on the television, I watch something like Dublin Murders, right? I don't know if any of you are watching this one, but Dublin Murders has been on recently. And almost every programme I watch, it's about damaged people. Right? Everyone is damaged, right? And they're usually damaged from their childhood, and they're harmed. And I'm very concerned that this is the image we have about the world we live in. That we have this world of damaged people abusing each other, and their childhood is just a big bag of abuse, right? And all these other questions like poverty and everything else that used to capture our imaginations just disappear. And all we see is this, all our politicians appear to see, is like parents who are potentially abusive to their children. And that we've got to get in. We've got to get in early intervention, stop them smacking, stop them doing this. And I think it's based on a really quite grotesque view of the public. And it appears to be this kind, caring sort of approach, but I think actually underneath it all, it's quite an unpleasant sense of people that
Well, I agree with that, and you know, there's a discussion to be had about how aversive discipline fits into a socialisation process with young children, and that's an important discussion for us to have. The idea that you would then link that to criminalising people, so that's to say, you know, actually criminalising them, you know, policing their behaviour, charging them with offences, making this part of the criminal law. I mean, something has gone seriously wrong in the way people involved in developing these policies and involved in government are thinking. And it's absolutely a million miles away from any understanding of authoritative parenting. I mean, and it was something Barnum was very clear on. You know, she said it should be the concern of professionals who work with parents to respectfully offer them alternative disciplinary strategies, i.e. to have a respectful discussion about different ways that we might best socialise our children, rather than to condemn parents for using methods consonant with their own, but not the counsellor's values and beliefs. You know, and it's a very, very important view that has now been replaced by using the full force of the criminal law to attack people who might disagree about the relative merits of time out versus giving a kid a smack when they're having a really massive tantrum, right? And you know, I think it's worth recognising just how far this has gone. You know, if you go back and read parenting advice from the 1960s, so for example, Dr. Spock, right, who's not, you know, exactly known as some great authoritarian, you know, in his book he says that it's better to bring it to a head and clear the air. If a little kid is having a really big tantrum, it's better to just give them a smack and bring it to a head than to have the whole thing hanging over. And from his point of view, the worst thing that a parent could do is try and have a discussion. And you do now hear mums doing this, where they go, oh, please don't do that anymore, it's really upsetting mummy. And the point that he was making is that to try and load that kind of emotional baggage onto a little child who is developmentally unable to deal with that is actually worse than giving them a smack, right? This is just about little children, that's all. That's all this is about. And you know, I mean, there's things that we should or could discuss further about this, about the complete misuse of the concept rights of this, both rights of the child and parental rights, which are, it's completely misused and completely understood in this whole discussion, and it's that misuse that I think ends up in this approach where you end up with the criminal law, and it just has no place in a discussion about how as adults we socialise and raise our children. You know, there aren't parents' rights and children's rights. We're not enemies, which the state then sets apart.
Well, they say that it's about equality, so that you're sort of characterising it as about you know, how children are raised and about parenting, but they would say it's about equality and equal protection. So adults and children should have the same equal protection. And it's almost a mad understanding of what a small child is. You know, the idea that a 3 or 4 year old child, I mean, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about aversive discipline as part of socialisation. We're talking about little children under 6, right? They are not rights-bearing citizens in conflict with the adult world. I mean, brilliant. Can I just read out a quote? Because we've got a brilliant
well,
quote from Cable which really explains
Gideon is
this, but I don't know.
outnumbered. So just hold it. Gideon, is there something you want to add?
Only briefly say that I keep thinking about the whole means and ends thing, and I think that you're both talking as if the whole project here, this ultimate aim, and the thing that it would feel, that would really make it feel good about itself, is the criminalisation of parents. And I just think that's a deliberate straw manning of what's going on. And actually for reasons which you yourself are saying. So the charge I think that's emerging from this is not that. The charge is that it's a mistaken aim in the first place. In other words, we shouldn't be trying to intervene in the relationship between parents and children in this kind of way. Because after all, the criminalisation thing is not the point of the project. The point of the project is, as Ashley says, to safeguard children against certain kinds of potentially harmful interaction, right? So I just think it's unfair, however wrong-headed you might think it is. I think it's just really unfair to assume that the motivation behind this is that they would take no greater pleasure than in seeing a whole load of parents banged up and their kids, wondering where mum's gone. I really don't think that's the point.
Look, I accept that the people writing these documents are completely confused. I mean, that's one of my main points. I think they're completely confused. I don't think they understand the concepts. I don't think they understand the literature. So I'm not necessarily saying that this is some conspiracy to lock up loads of parents, but they're certainly very confused. And they do say here, which is the most peculiar conclusion, it's acknowledged that there is unlikely to be any research evidence which specifically shows the effects of a light and infrequent smack as being harmful to children. But it's also a question of principle. So what is the criminalisation principle? Well, in here, it's just because the Welsh Government thinks it's got to go along with the UN. That's the principle. And what I'm saying is that I think that is completely unhelpful as a way of having any productive discussion in society about what we're supposed to be doing with kids.
I've just said one last thing. Or the principle could simply be there are things you shouldn't do to children, even if some may argue that they have beneficial effects. And that this is one of those things. That's the way I hear the principle. It's not, oh, we should just do what the United Nations says. It's kind of the other way around. Because the United Nations is working on the assumption that we should err on the side of not doing certain things if there was a potential risk to them.
Okay, so the principle is there are some things we shouldn't do. I think that keep that question in mind. I want to know what you think. Responses and questions. It doesn't have to be a question. Show of hands. Anyone who wants to? Yeah. So there.
Yes.
There. Yeah. So first go ahead. That's fine.
I just wondered where you think the line is then. I'm really quite confused about your arguments in terms of harm. When is it acceptable to hit a child? When is it not?
Great. And you want to ask a question?
Yes, I wanted to make a point which is very, not a very theoretical point really, but it is that having worked with politicians for a very long time, not as a politician, I think you should not underestimate how difficult it is to do or to think or to go through these debates. And it occurs to me that the action on smacking is a way of them doing something when in fact they can't afford to do the things they ought to do, which is to fund social workers to work like social workers I know with children who do exactly what you were describing, which is to encourage the parents to think about the way they're treating the children and to give them the support, often in very difficult circumstances where they have been seen as being parents who are putting the children in risk. So I think it's that is the axis for me, is the politicians not having the wherewithal to do what some of them, a lot of them, know they should be doing, which is funding that kind of supportive service for parents, which is not intervention as much as support.
Yeah.
Could I ask that Ellie make the third point sections?
The
Sorry, I
third
didn't
point.
hear that.
Can you make your
Can
third
you make
point?
the third point? Okay.
Well, the third point, do you want me to do that now?
No, we'll come back. Another question? Yeah?
A sort of question. I'd just like you to qualify a little bit more clearly, perhaps with some evidence, that you talk about rich and poor parents. I don't think you actually mean that. Rich parents are good parents and poor parents are bad. I don't think that's what you mean. But I would like you, for the sake of the record, to qualify it, and if you do think it's true, give evidence.
So another hand over. Oh, okay, yeah.
There's a couple of things I was thinking. It seems like we're seeking to pathologise this a lot, talking about risk, about safety. Is it a risk for the child, or is there safety there? And so that's the approach that we come, as in pro or con the debate. But we talk about having to have an evidence base to support what we're saying. But what about avoiding those approaches? What about actually looking at this from an ethical and a moral point of view? Is it okay for somebody who's 5 times bigger to hit and hurt another being, another living being? I don't think that is okay. It's not okay to hit a child. And we're talking about spanking them when they have a tantrum for a little child. Their brain architecture is emotionally immature. They're not able to emotionally regulate. How can we expect them to behave in a construct that we've made as an adult anticipation of that child's behaviour?
Okay, and then the last one.
Yes, along the lines of perhaps, because I feel like smacking is more like creating fear compared to enabling the child to understand the issues. So I'm just trying.
Sorry, could you speak up a bit?
Sorry,
There's
yes.
a lot of noise in
I feel like smacking or physical punishment is like creating fear in the child compared to enabling them to understand. But I can acknowledge how you feel, how you understand that criminalising it, in my opinion, is not the correct path to go down. But I do feel that physical punishment is not appropriate. But I'm proposing an alternative compared to it. So I'm just trying to think what would be your proposal other than what's been described.
Okay, and I guess I'll take 2 more and that's it, and then we'll come back.
I think it's more like a comment. I just feel I've got a 3-year-old, and I couldn't smack her personally, not even just a tap on the hand. I don't know. I have thought about it because obviously, I'm young, I do struggle. She puts me under a lot of pressure because she's not well for obvious reasons. But what I do feel is what feels wrong probably is me going to smack her now, like within me, it feels wrong to do that. So whether it's just a light thing, so I feel like, should we really be teaching our children the wrong thing to do? Because although it might not be actually, do you know what I mean, like affecting them, if I actually spiritually feel like that's the wrong thing to do. Yeah. So.
And then finally.
Yeah, I think the simple statistics that 80% of the population, parents, have smacked their child. And the fact that there's nowhere near that proportion of the population who've ended up with serious problems, or any problems for that matter, clearly indicates that smacking does not necessarily lead to problems. So that's the first thing, and you don't need to be a statistician to work out that there can't be an evidence base, a statistical evidence base, to say that smacking does harm. It's obvious by it's self-explanatory. But I just wanted to pick up a second point, because we kind of drifted, I think, to having a discussion around smacking, and we've been trying to have a little bit of a dialogue around motivation on the part of the politicians and policymakers. But I think you've got to look much wider, look at the pattern of policy direction to get a sense of what's really going on. So, smacking is one step that's been proposed in Wales, it's in Scotland. We've got the named person scheme, which you referred to in Scotland. Yes, it's been scrapped, but it's proposed. It's their thinking that's important. It's their thinking. We also have in Wales currently a consultation out regarding the withdrawal of the right for parents to withdraw their children from religious education. What is actually happening with all of these things? There's even proposals in England at the moment to forcibly inoculate children, forcibly vaccinate them. It's a clamping down on parental autonomy. It's a clamping down on discussion between state and parent. The pattern is very, very clear that's emerging. There's a wedge being driven between parents and children. And when we've seen this in the past, it sounds horrible. I'm much more cynical about it than I think has even been proposed by some of the stronger comments. This pattern emerges when political ideology becomes extreme. So communism, both far left and far right, we saw it in Nazi Germany, and you might say, oh, that's extreme, isn't it? But what happens is there's an attempt to control the thinking and the minds of children. And all of these things are going in that direction. So now it's the state that says, we teach your children values, and we will do it this way. And parents, if they get in the way, we will criminalise them, because they must have this value. Similarly, with this consultation that's out now regarding religious education and sexuality, if you don't toe the line, we will stop you. We will introduce law. And my final observation on this, sorry, I know I'm going on a little bit, is that if this persists, it will just generate more and more conflict. That dialogue that you were talking about, it doesn't exist anymore, and the agenda, I think, is pretty clear now.
Okay, so lots, you don't have to respond to everything, but just one or two points that you want to pick up on. I want to be more generous with time because I know that it's quite lopsided. So, so Gideon, do you want to come back on before?
Okay, in no particular order. Just to be clear, I wasn't saying that rich or poor parents are better. I was just saying that as a matter of principle, in the name of equality, we probably want to ensure that the prospects for rich and poor children are evened up, notwithstanding the fact that some of those are rich and some of those are poor. So the kinds of initiatives that we do to promote them are things like the provision of free education and a national health service and stuff like that, right? Now, there is always, so I certainly wasn't saying the rich children are better. In fact, there is some evidence rich parents are better. In fact, there is some evidence that some of the things that really, really well-off parents do are relatively harmful. Boarding schools are not great things to do to your kids, actually, for various very predictable reasons, for example. So the idea that somehow you're automatically on a golden road to fabulousness if you've got rich parents, it doesn't sound up at all. And much of the very best parenting is done by people who are very poorest, and there's a lot of very good evidence for that. So absolutely not saying what I worried that you might have thought I was saying. It's rather the other way around, is that if we worry about the potential gap between the better off and worse off kids, that's the kind of reason that we often give for intervening. So it was just to say that the idea of intervention itself is not necessarily some authoritarian thing. It actually can be done precisely in the name of promoting the capacity of those kids, as you might say, to become free-thinking, flourishing, independent adults who can do stuff for themselves. On what Paul's saying there at the end, I think we simply just hear different things in the same policies. So I think that there is certainly a way in which you could say, you could read all of those things that you listed as being examples of a kind of clamping down on parental autonomy. I think about them differently. I think that the tension, that's why I began where I began. I was trying to avoid talking about smacking, just to talk about the title of our whole thing, just think about, well, what's going on with children, parents in the state? I just think that we would have a very real tension anyway between what we value in terms of family autonomy and other things. And I just think this is one way of coming at that. All ways of trying to intervene there will be clunky, but all ways of leaving things alone have deep problems attached to them as well. So if we simply say, let's leave families be to come up with their own plans to tackle everything, we just have to be realistic that that will lead, amongst other things, to a drastically unequal society in certain kinds of ways. And to say that isn't to say that we should somehow be putting political values in the heads of kids and turning them into robots who've been programmed to teach a certain kind of way. It feels to me like it's just saying you should make good on the idea that all kids deserve something like a fair go, and that there are some circumstances which are really going to mitigate against that. I'm not sure. Last point. I'm not sure that, or maybe that might be one more. I'm not sure that we can draw much conclusion from the fact that lots of people have been smacked and they're not all evil or damaged or or whatever. The causes and effects there are much too complicated.
That was my point. Both directions.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we probably agree on that. That you've got to be very, very careful with ascribing causes and effects when you're discussing this kind of stuff. Because I agreed with the kind of sentiment with a lot of the questions, the only other thing I would like to say, it's actually on your point, which I thought was a really profound one, about the fact that yes, this policy looks like a bad proxy in some ways for something else which should ideally be done. So I kind of agree with that. It's like, why should we even be spending time discussing this very, very specific issue when there are deep problems about how you support parents in the first place? Now, I suspect that some of my colleagues on the panel might not quite like the social work solution either. I generally quite do, but I suspect that sounds like nanny statism from a certain kind of angle. I just don't see it that way at all, because I think that if you go that way, then you're basically saying that all kinds of support that we might seek to offer anybody is some kind of overweening indoctrination done by do-gooders who are up to something else. I just don't actually believe that's the case. I really appreciated your point.
Stuart or Ellie?
Well, your argument about ethical or moral, I prefer that argument, because the people who promote this often hide behind evidence. They say evidence proves, and the reality is it's just that they have a moral position. I mean, personally, I disagree with you, but you can have your opinion, and that's fine. We live in a free society, and you should be able to have your moral values, and I should be able to have mine. That's what being in a free society is. We can disagree with each other, but you shouldn't have the police then coming in to batter me and lock me up because I disagree with your moral position. As it happens, I think it's very confusing. I think what you said is that you can't bring yourself to smack your child. It worries me that I think we now live in a world where we're bringing up young adults who are terrified of being authoritative with their children, and particularly that a smack is going to do some kind of psychological harm to children, which is just not true. And that...
Well, I made the point to say that even if it didn't affect them, I still find within me that it's wrong.
Yeah. Well, that's fine, and that's it. That's interesting, and it's fine. I mean, I wrote an article I write an article in the Scottish Press, and I wrote an article about the smacking thing, and people come on and say, oh yeah, that's right, yeah, support the beating of children, blah blah, and all the rest of it. And I got this very interesting letter, and the person said, I had a 5-year-old, so it was a six-year-old daughter. My wife was pregnant. My 6-year-old daughter didn't like that she was pregnant, and she'd started to kick her in the stomach. And we never smacked, and we didn't know what to do, because we didn't want to smack our child. But we said, if you do that again, we're going to smack you, because you could actually, you could kill the baby inside their stomach. He says, the mother was pulling her out the bath, pregnant mother, and the child lifts a foot up to kick her in the stomach, and the husband rushes in and smacks her on the backside. What was really interesting is he then says, I've got the letter there if you want to read it, he says, I was then physically sick at what I had done. And that concerns me, that people are so uptight about what they see as the potential harm that they're doing, and and seem to build a kind of moral framework around this thing, smacking your kid's backside. I mean, you know, all I can say is smacking your kid's backside, it's no big deal. I mean, it really isn't. Smacking a 6-year-old's bottom is going to have, and he says, oh, by the way, it had no impact on my child. She never did it again. I didn't have to smack her again, blah, 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 etc., etc. But it seems to be a real thing in society at the minute that we become incredibly anxious about things that are not that important because they've been made into this huge issue by professionals and so-called experts who portray children as these sort of like potentially damaged, fragile little things who are at risk from their parents. And I think that's something that needs to be challenged because it's such a horrible view of and problematic view of both parents and children.
Can I just object to you demonising professionals? You've got a constant attack on
I'm going to come out to the audience in a second. I just want to give Ellie a chance to respond. But that's a good point. Just hold it.
Well, the third point was, it's actually the one that I'd made, but it's probably got lost in lots of things, was about professionals and Bowring's point about the relationship between professionals and the adults that they're dealing with, and her point about the need for respectful discussion in a grown-up sense. And I do think it's really important because I think that part of what's going on at the moment, and the point that you make about what's going on around vaccination is a very, very instructive example, is that I think that this process that governments are now engaged with looking to the criminal law and looking to sanctions, it doesn't only deauthorise parents as adults, it also deprofessionalises the professions. And I think it is, you know, quite a lot of it is just a cheap way of doing things, which is never going to work, right? But it destroys a lot in the process of doing things. So, you know, with the vaccination question, what's going on at the moment, you know, the idea that what you would do in the face of some parents feeling nervous about vaccinating their children, what you would do is introduce compulsion, legal sanctions, which in the way these work in countries at the moment where this has happened, is that you remove the right of children to have a state education in order to punish the parent. I mean, that is now seriously being discussed, right? That is the proposal. And it's another example of a really, really terrible idea that governments are thinking of. I think actually it's very, very objected to by anybody that's had anything to do with a baby clinic. It's certainly objected to by most GPs, most people involved in providing public health to parents, because what they understand is that actually you need a lot more going into the vaccination service to be able to have grown-up discussions with parents about vaccination instead of, you know, coming in with compulsion. So I think that's a really serious problem, and I think that the professions need to speak up about this and stand their ground in terms of what it means to actually work with parents as adults, to work together to do the best we can with the children. In terms of your point about, can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
In terms of your point about the moral content of this, I think this is substantially a moral question, and I think that what's at issue when we're talking about the whole question of the socialisation process and then raising a new generation who can be autonomous and act willfully to develop the world which is going to be their world, that is substantively a moral question. It's a question of how we develop a capacity for moral independence in our children in a way which is developmentally appropriate. And what I'm saying, and this is one of the things about Bowring that I find most convincing, most interesting, there's a lot of developmental psychology I'm not very convinced by, but I think there's aspects of what she argued which are very, very compelling, is to understand that little children do not have moral capacity. They're not there yet. What they need is boundaries, they need certainty, and they need clarity. And it's in that sense that a disciplinary encounter becomes important. It's part of boundary setting, and it's part of doing what's appropriate in terms of their emotional and developmental capacities. Now, there's different ways of doing that, but adults have to do it, You know, you have to say no and mean it and stick with it. You know, you have to give them rules, you have to give them boundaries. And to place smacking just outside of that inevitably, and to call it hitting, to call it violence, to call it hurting, I think the language is just running away with itself, and to be honest, I just think it's a bit silly because of what we're talking about here. I think what we're talking about needs to be understood for what it is, because it's very important to be able to do this with little children, to socialise them effectively, to give them clear boundaries, to have them understand right from wrong in a very simple way that's developmentally appropriate. As children grow up, they need to have a much more sophisticated understanding of discussions around right and wrong, and a much more thoroughgoing discussion and sense of morality and what morality means and what it means to engage with the world in a moral fashion, and to make their own arguments and drive things forward in the way a new generation will need to do. Now, my concern, and it's a huge concern, is that we are absolutely failing doing this with a new generation. You can see it all around you, right? We're not doing a very good job of bringing new adults into the world who can then do what they need to do in the world. You know, anybody that works in a university can tell you this, right?
About our students.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna
They're not as grown up as they need to be, right? We're not helping them grow up.
I won't have time for one more. Okay, so there are students in this room. So I'm going to take it out one more time to the floor. So show of hands. I believe you wanted to say something.
I come back to my point. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name.
Stuart.
Stuart. You demonise those in positions of government and the professions. You've said it several times. A lot. I am a children's nurse. I know that a lot of my colleagues, paediatricians, social workers, teachers, those who work with children a lot, I would say the vast majority of them are against smacking children. They see it as wrong. And I would imagine they would support this law. This law isn't perfect, no law is perfect, but it draws a line with adults hitting, being violent towards children for a very good reason. It's wrong. I don't care what you think about parents' rights or what have you. Hitting children is wrong. It's just wrong. I've had the privilege of being involved in lots of families' lives. It doesn't work.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So I smack my children.
Yes.
Right. Do you think I should be arrested for that?
No, but
So
I do think smacking them is wrong.
Right, but the law is, so at the minute, the law in Scotland anyway, is that if you, before this new law, it was already a law that if you smacked your child hard, it was against the law, right? Implement, head, etc. Right? So you already had that. This now, I mean, it's almost like, it's just bizarre that it's almost like they've got nothing else to do,
Yeah.
right? Because you already got a law that if you do that,